Here's what a pair of recently retired married couples, four close friends, did on their first visit to Utah's national and state parks and Arizona's Grand Canyon. Our journey began early on October 10th, 2018, when we flew together from Baltimore to Salt Lake City. We rented a minivan and Chris drove to our first Airbnb, an apartment near the Mormon Temple, for a 2-night stay. Our first stop was the campus of the LDS Church and Visitor Center. After exploring the facilities, we ate lunch at a restaurant on the 10th floor of a hotel across from the Mormon Temple. Then we did a drive-by of the University of Utah campus, home of the Utes. Next morning, Thursday, we went out for coffee at a nearby supermarket, then drove north toward Ogden to explore Antelope Island State Park in the Salt Lake.
We're in Antelope Island in Utah, by the shores of the Great Salt Lake.
We drove to Buffalo Point, parked and walked over soggy sand past tall grasses to the shore. The lake was very calm. Cloudy, cool weather gave it a somber appearance. On the way home to Salt Lake City, we stopped at a nearby sports outfitter. Chris and Pat bought binoculars. Janice bought a warm wool cap and gloves. On Friday, we loaded up and drove to Provo, Utah, for a visit to Brigham Young University. We then drove about 2 hours to Price, Utah. The views along the way featured spectacular desert vistas. We stopped for several minutes to see Grand View Overlook on the side of the highway before arriving at Red Moon Lodge just before sunset. We met the owner, George, while we explored the property. The next morning, Saturday, we drove to nearby Arches National Park in Moab, Utah, and were astounded by the vistas starting as soon as we passed the entry station and continuing nonstop as we started our hike at the end of the park road in Devil's Garden, where we easily found parking at 9:30 a.m. We hiked for 3 hours from the trailhead to Landscape Arch, stopping at Pine Tree and Tunnel Arches, and chatted with a couple from Indiana, and then headed back to the trailhead. The weather was ideal. The overlook of Delicate Arch was closed due to flooding, so we opted out of hiking there, as the parking lot was full and we were kind of pooped anyway from the hike to Landscape Arch. We returned to our lodge and rested, and about 4:30 headed to Dead Horse Point State Park. A geology professor was lecturing to a small class on the cliffs. In the distance, we spotted a couple getting married cliffside. Pat photographed the skeleton of a dead animal tucked in a nearby rock. We guessed it was the remains of either a coyote or a bobcat. At sunset, we took in the views. Wow! We headed back to Moab to dinner. After dinner, we returned to the Red Moon Lodge to sleep. On Sunday, October 14th, we split to Canyonlands National Park after buying lunch provisions in Moab. We ducked into the visitor center in Canyonlands partly to get out of the cold, windy weather and to get oriented. There we got maps and information about the park and drove to Mesa Arch and made the short hike to the spectacular overlook. Afterwards, we hiked to Upheaval Dome. Pat and Chris hiked almost the entire way. Len and Janny went most of the way. Then we all returned to Moab for gas and took a gelato and coffee break. After coffee, we bid a fond adieu to Moab. And Janice drove us all to Torrey, Utah, through the San Jacinto Desert most of the way, seeing much grandeur along Route 24's scenic highway. Our next accommodations were booked at Capitol Reef Resort. We pulled in just at sunset. Capitol Reef Resort offered the opportunity to sleep in either Conestoga wagons, teepees, or a standalone two-bedroom cabin. We chose the cabin. Our cabin had 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, comfortable beds, a full porch and deck, and spectacular mountain views. A great night's sleep quickly followed. We awoke Monday about 8 a.m., then drove to the Chimney Rock trailhead and started our hike. Pat and Janice went all the way to the top of a mesa, about 300 feet in elevation, for a view of Chimney Rock, while Chris and Len did the first half of that trail, then headed to Gooseneck's trailhead for a short hike to its grand overlook. Janice and Pat returned around 1 p.m. after completing the Chimney Rock Trail. Then we visited a petroglyphs site and heard a talk by Park Ranger Emily.
Meat would have been much more difficult than it would have been to store plants. So plants were much easier to store. So for these reasons, the Fremont didn't have a plant-based diet, and we see evidence of that here in our park. One of the things we definitely know that they ate were pinyon pine nuts. These are things we still eat today. We put these in our pesto.
We then took a 5-mile ride into the park to view more stunning cliffs, returning to our cabin as the sun was setting. Next morning, we left Capitol Reef at 8:30 a.m., and after briefly driving through Torrey and stopping to photograph a life-size dummy in a police uniform in a squad car, we drove 3 hours to our next destination, Bryce Canyon National Park. We drove over mountains with snow. After Pat and Janny talked to the park ranger, we followed his suggestion to hike down the Navajo Loop Trail, featuring rock structures called hoodoos, dropping our elevation by 690 feet. The hike back included aptly named Wall Street Switchbacks. This cannot be real.
Yay!
Yahoo!
Happy now? You did it! Fabulous.
Fantastic.
Okay, you ready to do it again?
Yeah.
10 years from now.
That's right. In 10 years, we do it again.
The Navajo Loop Trail was strenuous and spectacular. On the recommendation from a friend back home, we stopped at a nearby family-owned restaurant, famous for its pie and soup, and shared some blueberry banana cream pie served by the pie maker's nephew. Then drove 3.5 hours to Cedar City, stopping briefly at Calf Creek Campground in Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, and walked along the creek along the bouncy bridge. We continued on to Cedar City, checked in to our next B&B in a Victorian mansion. The accommodations were beautiful. The next morning, Wednesday, our host prepared a home-cooked breakfast. Then we left Cedar City for our next destination, Zion National Park. We arrived at Zion at 1 p.m. and found all the parking lots full, even in late October. We therefore went to our new lodging, Zion Under Canvas, a remote tent community, for a unique one-night adventure called glamping, for glamorous camping. In this setup, each couple's accommodations consisted of a roomy canvas tent with an outdoor deck, indoor plumbing, luxury king-size bed, and a sky view of the stars at night unhindered by any artificial light. We checked in and had lunch on Chris and Pat's deck, and at 4 p.m. returned to Zion. This time, we easily found parking and hiked the Watchman's Trail. We all did that hike, meeting a retired Alaskan tugboat captain at the top. It was a tough hike up, 2 miles with 460 feet of elevation. The walk back was easier, but still a challenge. We drove back to our glamping site about 30 minutes outside the national park. We made a fire to warm us and enjoyed looking at the stars from our ultra comfy, warm beds. Next morning, Thursday, we met for 8 a.m. breakfast at the community tent. Then we drove back through a tunnel in Zion National Park to Kanab, Utah, where we visited the nationally recognized Good Friends Animal Sanctuary. We then had a long drive to Arizona through desert Navajo country.
So that's south of Grand Canyon.
Tucson
is, yes.
It's definitely.
With great anticipation, we arrived at the Grand Canyon South Rim, parked and walked to Desert View Watchtower, built by architect Mary Coulter. We took a quick view of the Grand Canyon before driving to Tucson, south of the park, to check in at the Grand Hotel. Next morning, Friday, the weather was a bit cold, about 40 degrees. We drove to the El Tovar Hotel where Chris and Pat would be staying, right on the Rim Trail. The next morning, Saturday, after breakfast, we hiked the Rim Trail to Mather Point, stopping at the Geology Museum. The Rim Trail hike gave us our first serious views of the Grand Canyon. After lunch, we all visited the Kolb Art Museum and Gallery overlooking the canyon. A lovely way to end the day. Next morning, Sunday, we had a thunderstorm with hail and lightning. The hotel concierge suggested not hiking into the canyon in such conditions. However, the weather improved, so Pat and Janny went on a short hike on the Bright Angel Trail.
We're on the Bright Angel Trail in Grand Canyon.
And we haven't started the walk back up yet, right?
No, we
That-
just made it down. I don't know, 2, 3, 4,000 feet.
Yeah, and I can see by the smile on your face that we haven't started back up.
We're going to that corner and we're turning back.
Good.
Chris and Len explored the museums and gift shops, then rested at the hotel lobby. We checked out of our hotel, and around 1 p.m. we all met at the car and headed to our next stop, Flagstaff, Arizona. Our accommodations in Flagstaff were clean and comfy. We took an evening side trip to the Lowell Observatory. On Monday, we headed to breakfast at the Toasted Owl. Our waiter was a skier from Maine. He had us vote on an art competition of owls, all owls. Following our server's advice, we then headed to Snow Bowl for a hike at altitudes just under 10,000 feet. We marveled at the quaking aspen trees while roaming through the autumn forest called the Kachina Trail. A graying gentleman with his lady friend took our picture. Before driving to Sedona, we stopped at wonderful Slide Rock State Park in Oak Creek Canyon, featuring towering red cliffs and a 5-star swimming hole. We ended up that afternoon in Sedona, then drove to our Airbnb, which turned out to be a group favorite, an Alice in Wonderland themed house. We took selfies with Mad Hatter props provided by our absent hosts. On Tuesday, we all met for a visit to the local art museum. On Wednesday, we drove to explore a nearby Buddhist stupa and saw its medicine wheel. The stupa induced us to become contemplative on a sunny, bright, breezy day. On Thursday, we dropped Janny off at the local library to do a bit of post-retirement work. We explored the library, then Chris, Pat, and Len drove to Red Rock State Park and hiked a bit of the Oak Creek Trail. We photographed the sights and chatted with a lady teaching her students about water conservation. She also recommended visiting Roosevelt, an art center, as part of our Phoenix tour. We picked up Janny and drove an hour and a half to Phoenix on a high plateau, ascending to 4,000 feet.
Wow!
On the way, we stumbled upon Arcasante, an experimental microcity seeking radical reorganization of the built environment by integrating architecture and ecology. After a brief tour, we took pictures of amazing saguaro cactus, posing with these behemoths that stood over 20 feet tall. As we got closer to Phoenix, traffic built. We arrived at our final Airbnb at 4 p.m. We got settled, then ate dinner. Next morning, we had breakfast at an excellent nearby Mexican-style bistro. Then came a visit to the Heard Museum, which was a highlight of our trip. This museum is the world's preeminent museum for the presentation, interpretation, and advancement of American Indian art, specifically American Indians of the Great Southwest. We spent 3 hours there. The small upstairs area featured a hard-to-take exhibit called The Boarding School Experience, presenting the history of an official policy set up by the U.S. government from the mid-19th century designed to reshape the Native American youth population to reform and, quote, civilize them in order to solve what came to be called the, quote, Indian problem. The policy involved taking Indian children of school age far from their homes and families, cutting their hair, dressing them in Western clothes instead of traditional leather garb, and forcing them to speak English by punishing their use of their native languages. Several hundred such boarding schools were set up across the U.S., operating well into the 1900s. We sat recapping our experiences of the museum and our trip overall. The next morning, Saturday, we flew home. Thus ended our great Southwest journey for 4 newly retired close friends. And nobody got hurt!